Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and this video is the fourth in our series on terrain building to help celebrate the launch of the new Team Yankee supplement, the West Germans. In our previous episodes, I've covered some builds to design a spread to celebrate the launch of the new West German book. First, we used the Mechanics Workshop by Battlefront Miniatures and souped it up to make it interesting and appropriate for the time and the era. Then we went on and made a helicopter pad, and we put the excellent PAH West German helicopter model in the middle as a centerpiece. Then we followed up by using the factory building as an administration building or as a command center for our military base. This brings us to the final piece, and that's a hangar for the helicopter. Now, Battlefront doesn't make a model of a helicopter hangar, so we're going to make it from scratch. And of course, when it's all over, then we're going to do a reveal of the spread. So, without any further ado, let's get to building.
Like always, the first thing I do is get out my original plan and check to see how the building is ruled out. Then I get out a sheet of foam core and I cut out the shape of the base. In this case, the base is 9 inches wide by 7 inches deep. After the base is cut out, I lay out the base next to the previous pieces of terrain and use that to mark off the shape of the stone pavers on the ground. Then I go in with a pen and I score the shape of the pavers into the surface, forming a grid pattern. Later in the project, I need to create a corrugated metal effect, so I go get a piece of cardboard that has a fairly fine corrugation in it, and I soak it in some water for about 15 minutes. After it's thoroughly soaked, I then go and peel the paper off of it. I leave this for a couple days to dry. We'll come back to it later in the project. Now it's time to build the walls for the left, right, and back. I get the measurements from my plan, and then go back to my foam core and I cut them out according to the correct size. Then, taking some windows that I 3D printed, I lay the panels out and I cut out a space for them. The next step I do is a very important one when scratch building structures. Frequently what happens is people just build them with slab sides and then wonder why they don't have a lot of visual appeal. In this case, I'm going to build a frame to go over each wall, cut from Bristol board. I go ahead and cut it out to make it look like there's a metal structure reinforcing the building from the outside. To enhance the detail, I take out a pen and score some panels into the side of the wall to make it look like there's some siding there. Now I take out my super glue and glue the 3D printed windows into place. Then take out some Mod Podge and spread it on the back of the Bristol board and push it down over each wall section. After I've got it in place, I put some heavy bottles on top of it and set it aside to dry. At this point I cut out the front wall, and it's really just a rectangle that's the same size as the back wall, but it's got a 5-inch gap cut out of the middle to form the front door for the hangar. The doors themselves are made from a portion of the corrugated cardboard that we created earlier. First I cut them to the right size and I glue them onto a backing of some stiff card and then go ahead and glue them in place on the front wall. After that, I get out a length of bamboo skewer and glue it along the top to imply a runner for the door sections to move on. This pretty much completes the basic shape for the walls, so then I move on to the roof. I start by taking the front and back walls and use a compass to scribe out the shape of an arch. After this is done, I cut 3 of them out. These 3 arches will now form the gables, one for the front wall, one for the back wall, and one to go in the middle to build support. I move on to creating 3 cross beams by cutting these out of foam core, and taking the center gable, I cut a slot out for each of the beams to insert through, and I go ahead and put the beams through, glue them into place, and then glue the ends on. I make sure the whole thing is the same width as the building itself. With the basic structure of the roof now built, I take out my hot glue and apply it to the sides and begin to wrap a length of the cardboard corrugation around the outside of the roof. This will form a corrugated metal roof and give it lots of interesting variety and texture. The walls were now mostly finished, as well as the roof, but I decided before I assembled them I would add some details in the form of some small rivets. And I used an old model builder's trick. I got out some super glue and a fine bamboo skewer, and using the point of the skewer, I dipped it in the glue. I then pressed the point of the skewer against any portion of the model where I wanted to form a rivet, and left it to dry. Once I was satisfied with my rivets, and when they were dry, I then took out my hot glue gun and glued the walls into place. In some spots, I decided to use a square to make sure that everything was aligned at right angles. With the building now assembled, I raided my bits box for small details that I could attach to the building to make it look just that much more interesting or lived in. I went through various sprues and picked out parts that I thought would look good and just went ahead and glued them on. In some spots I used wire and other materials to build specific little details. I'm not going to get too far into it because it would be kind of boring, but it's always very important to find some small points of interest and to put them into your builds. With the majority of the build complete, I then took the model out to the garage and primed it with matte black spray paint. After the spray paint had had a couple hours to dry, I then went ahead and started to paint the building with my airbrush. I started with medium camouflage brown, sprayed the structure down with it, then moved on to off-white, and gave a very light spray of white, concentrating towards the outsides. I then got out a brush and used a quick dry brush of pure white just to bring out the extreme details as highlights. I then repeated the process with the roof, starting with blue-gray, moving to light gray, and finally dry brushing it with gunmetal. To add a splash of color, I made some signs out of some Bristol board and I painted them red. After I gave them a quick highlight, I took out a stencil and I stenciled on some letters and numbers in white. Now came time for chipping. To chip the building itself, I took out ivory paint, drew some scratches and dots all over the building, and then filled these in the center with some hull red to imply depth. For the roof, I basically did the same thing, but I used blue-gray before I stippled in some hull red. With this done, the building was ready for shading, so I took out some satin varnish and I gave it a couple coats. Then I got out some enamel dark wash, which is a heavily thinned enamel paint, and I used capillary action to run it into the crevices and deep spots on the models to imply some shadows. When the dark wash had dried, I then got out my rust effects and went and applied them over the chips and scratches. I used crusted rust over the larger patches of damage, and I used streaking rust to form lines where the rust was running down the face of the building or down the seams in the roof. When this had about 5 minutes to dry, I moistened a brush with some white spirits, and then I went in and blended it all out. This pretty much concluded the work on the building itself, so now I moved on to the base. I used the same procedure as I used on the other buildings in this series. First I masked it off with some masking tape. Then I took out some tan paint and dry brushed it over the base. followed this by a dry brush of light gray paint, and then dry brushed over top of that a very, very fine layer of pure white. Next, I removed the mask and then went and got out some 3D printed pallets, 55-gallon drums, and other things that I could put around the base. I then followed up by painting these some different colors. Green for the barrels, brown for the wood. Then once that had dried, I went and got out my dry pigments. I worked them into the surface of the base to weather it, focusing on dark browns, ochres, and lighter dust colors. After these pigments were in place, there was no need for them to dry because they're, well, dry pigments, so I went ahead, got out my dark wash again, and lined in around the stone pavers. At this point, I felt a little bit of landscaping was required, so I got out a few lichens and hot glued them down in various spots around the base to imply that the building was partially overgrown with vegetation. Having completed that, this build was done, so I gave it 2 quick coats of matte varnish and left it to dry. And with that, this whole project, the entire West German spread, was done. Now I had 3 new buildings, the helicopter landing pad, and the PAH helicopter itself to act as a backdrop for my games of Team Yankee. All I need to do now is go out and actually get some West Germans to fight around it. All in all, I'm really pleased with how this project turned out. I'm a big proponent of the fact that Wargames terrain should be more than just playing pieces. It should be a type of art that makes a living, breathing environment that will enhance your games by providing a sense of time and place. I think the weathering, small details such as discarded equipment and materials around my base really help give it that look and feel. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope it inspires you to make your own awesome terrain. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please stay tuned for new content twice weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is your source for model building, miniature painting, wargaming, and diorama content. If you've not yet subscribed, make sure you do, and press the bell button to receive immediate notification so you do not miss out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.